Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
I didn't cry when I read the message, at least not right away. It was short, like it was written in a hurry between errands or school pickups. But I read it a dozen times, the words getting heavier with each pass, like they were growing roots and sinking straight through my chest. Hey Lisa, just wanted to give you a heads up. After a lot of thought, we've decided to keep things low stress this year and keep Christmas just immediate family. Hope you understand. That was it. No warmth, no curiosity about how I was doing, no invitation to call and talk it through. Just a polite, sterilized rejection from the only people I had ever allowed myself to call home. No names mentioned, but I wasn't stupid. I knew what low stress and immediate family really meant. I was the stress. I wasn't the family. And it wasn't even Karen who sent it. It was from Tom's email. Coward move. Classic. He's always been the errand boy in their marriage, the one who does the dirty work while Karen keeps her hands clean and her voice sweet. It was her words, though. I could hear them in my head in that tight, practiced tone she used when she was setting boundaries. Always just professional enough to pass for polite, but with the same emotional depth as a bank statement. That tone had always pissed me off, like she was some HR rep firing me from her personal life. It's funny, if you asked anyone in our family, they'd say Karen was the strong one, the stable one, the glue that held things together, the one with the calendar and the Pinterest Christmas decorations, and the two daughters who called her best friend on Instagram captions. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't see her silence the moment things got uncomfortable, how fast she retreated into her pretty little world the second someone else's emotions threatened to spill into hers, especially mine. See, Karen never had time for my sadness. When our dad died and I didn't get out of bed for days, she called once to tell me, "You can't let this define you," like I had chosen grief as some kind of fashion accessory. When my fiancé left me 3 months before the wedding, left me with the catering bill, the dress, the Airbnb for all the guests, she sent a meme. A goddamn meme. Something about new beginnings. I didn't even reply. And yet, despite all that, I kept showing up. Every Christmas, every birthday party, every school play, I bought gifts, I baked cookies, I overcompensated like it was a full-time job. I paid for Sophie's braces when their insurance wouldn't cover it. I paid for Ava's summer camp 3 years in a row. I covered the premiums when Karen got laid off during COVID, and they lost their health coverage. Nobody asked me to. I just did it, because I thought that's what family does, because I didn't want the girls to go without, because I remembered what it felt like to go without. So no, I didn't cry. I just sat there with my laptop open, staring at the screen while the email burned a hole in my brain. I read it again. Hope you understand. I understood. I understood that my usefulness had expired. I understood that the love I gave was only welcome if it came without needs of its own. I understood that I had mistaken proximity for connection and loyalty for love. I understood that I had been paying for a seat at a table that would never actually be mine. And once I understood all that, really truly understood it, I started typing. The thing about being emotionally draining is that it implies a resource, something finite that can be used up. And I realized then that for 15 years, I had been their emotional generator, their their safety net, and their unpaid therapist. I held everyone else's mess like it was my own. And now that I was a little heavier, a little harder to lift, they called me a burden and cut me loose. So I logged into my benefits portal. My employer offers one of the best family health plans in the state, something Karen begged me to include her on when Tom's company dropped dependent coverage. I had no kids of my own, no partner, so I said yes. I paid the extra monthly cost and never once asked her to reimburse me. When the girls had ear infections or seasonal asthma or whatever new allergy Ava developed that month, it was my coverage they used. When Karen needed her IUD replaced and the out-of-pocket was too high, she texted me a crying emoji, and I transferred $300 without blinking. I stared at the screen for a moment, my finger hovering over the remove dependent button. The silence in my apartment was so loud, it felt like the walls were holding their breath. And then I clicked. First Karen, then the girls. It was done in under a minute, cold, clinical, efficient, exactly the way they had just handled me. Next, I opened the portal to the girls' tuition accounts. I had set them up quietly, just like my dad once tried to do for us before his heart gave out at 54. Every month, a portion of my paycheck went into those accounts. It wasn't a fortune, but it would have covered at least community college. Karen never knew the exact numbers, but she knew they existed. She knew I was the fallback plan. I always was. I logged in, closed the accounts, and transferred the remaining balance into a high-yield savings under my name. I didn't even feel guilty. I felt awake, like I had been asleep for years, and someone finally shook me hard enough to open my eyes. The world hadn't changed, just my place in it. I didn't tell them. I didn't send a warning or a follow-up email. No explanations. They wanted boundaries. Well, here they were. Clean, sharp, irreversible boundaries. Funny how we talk about cutting people off like it's some kind of tantrum, like a hissy fit. But this wasn't a tantrum. This was clarity. This was what it looks like when the bridge finally burns down to the last plank and you stop trying to cross it. And here's where I want to ask you something. Really ask. Like you're sitting across from me at a kitchen table. Have you ever been told that you're too much, that your feelings are inconvenient, that your presence is conditional? Have you ever been labeled the problem simply because you stopped pretending everything was fine? If so, what did you do about it? Did you stay quiet? Or did you finally snap, like I did? Because I snapped. And that was only the beginning. It's strange how quickly you remember all the receipts once someone decides you were never invited in the first place. How fast your brain starts lining up every instance, every favor, every, of course, don't worry about it, that you shrugged off at the time. Telling yourself that's what family is for. That's what sisters do, even when the other one never once reciprocated without a sigh or a string attached. Or that thin little smile that said, "You're doing this because you want to feel useful, right?" But never once acknowledged what it cost you, not just in dollars, but in emotional bandwidth. In the slow erosion of self-worth that happens when you are loved only for what you give, never for who you are, when you finally run dry. I sat at my dining room table with my laptop still open, the cursor blinking in that quiet, smug way it does when there's nothing left to do, when you've clicked the buttons, closed the tabs, canceled the accounts, and there's no going back. I'd just pulled the plug on their health insurance and on the girls' tuition funds. Silent, brutal decisions that felt like removing an oxygen mask mid-flight, and yet all I felt was a hollow calm, like I had finally exhaled after holding my breath for too damn long. But then the phone rang. It was Tom. Of course it was Tom. Karen would never lower herself to confront me directly. That's what husbands are for, right? Her messenger boy. Her buffer. The man who once told me at Thanksgiving that I was, like the cool aunt but with trauma. As if that was meant to be funny. As if the word trauma was something you could toss around at a dinner table between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce. I didn't answer, not because I didn't want to talk, but because I knew what would come out of my mouth if I did, and for once, I wanted my actions to speak for me. He called again, then he texted. "Hey, Lisa. I think there's a mistake. Karen says the health insurance isn't working. Can you check it out?" A mistake. Sure, a clerical error. Not the deliberate hand of someone who had just been shoved to the outermost edge of her own family and decided, finally, to step off the ledge. I left the message unread, and then another came, this one with less polish. "Did you cancel the girls' college plans? Karen's freaking out. Freaking out. How poetic. Did she freak out when she hit send on the email that cut me out of Christmas without a shred of decency? Did she even pause to consider what that would feel like for someone who had spent her entire adult life being the third parent to her children? The unofficial aunt/babysitter/emotional garbage disposal? I went to my cabinet, poured myself a glass of wine, not fancy, not some carefully aged bottle, just the kind of cheap red that stains your teeth and burns your throat a little. The kind you keep around for nights like these when the line between anger and relief blurs into something that feels suspiciously like grief. I sat down again and I started writing. Not to Karen, not to Tom, not even to Mom. though I knew it was only a matter of time before she chimed in with her usual tear-soaked guilt parade. I wrote to myself a list, every financial decision I'd made for them since 2009. $3,000 for Sophie's orthodontist when Tom's job cut dental, $1,500 to bail them out when their water heater burst, and they were too proud to ask their church for help. Monthly premiums for 4 people on my insurance plan, over $200 a month, every month, for 7 years. That's nearly 20 grand if you do the math, and believe me, I did. 2 sets of plane tickets when the girls wanted to tour out-of-state schools, donations to their school fundraisers, last-minute babysitting gigs when they wanted a date night. The spare room I gave up every summer so the girls could stay in the city for their art camp. And the big one? The tuition accounts I'd been quietly funding since Ava was 6. Money they just assumed would be there when the time came, because I had always made sure it was. It was never about the money, not really. If it were, I'd have sent them an invoice. No, it was about the fact that none of it mattered once I started needing something back. Not money, just presence, empathy, a goddamn invitation to Christmas. You know, the holiday we've spent together every single year since we were old enough to understand who Santa really was. The holiday I made happen with presents and food, and last year, even the decorations because Karen said she was too exhausted, and I offered to help, like I always do. Because that's who I was. The helper, the fixer, the backup plan. Until I wasn't. They weren't going to see this coming, and maybe that's the part that made me feel the most alive. That for the first time in our entire dynamic, I wasn't predictable. I wasn't available. I wasn't the fallback option. I was the hand that quietly erased everything they'd taken for granted. And I did it without screaming, without warning, without even slamming a door. Just a few clicks, a few deletions, and suddenly the world they built on my sacrifices was wobbling, one support beam at a time. And before you say it, before you call me petty or vindictive, or ask what kind of woman punishes children for adult problems, let me stop you. I didn't take anything from those girls that belonged to them. I just stopped giving what was never truly mine to offer in the first place. You don't get to uninvite someone from your life and still expect their wallet to show up. That's not how it works. Or maybe it is in Karen's world, but not in mine, not anymore. As the night deepened and my phone buzzed again, this time from Mom, I silenced it without looking. There would be tears, there would be guilt, there would be Bible verses about forgiveness and lectures about family. But I had a new list now, and none of those things were on it. There's a certain silence that settles after you've detonated a truth bomb so precisely that there's no debris, no screaming, no instant explosion. Just a slow, creeping awareness that something has fundamentally shifted. And the people on the receiving end won't even realize it until the ground begins to dissolve beneath their feet. That was the kind of silence I chose the morning after I erased myself from their ecosystem. Not a dramatic exit, no social media outburst, no final confrontation, just the full and complete withdrawal of energy, access, and presence, which, in a family like ours, meant far more than any cutting remark ever could. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, the sun pushing through the cracks of the blinds, in that way it only does when you've been up too long and sleep has become irrelevant. And I stared at my phone, not because I wanted to answer it, God knows I didn't, but because I was watching the notifications pile up like a slow-moving avalanche, each one time-stamped and desperate in its own way. Karen's name appeared twice, then 3 times, then vanished into the sea of blocked numbers I had quietly moved her into the night before. Tom tried again, still under the illusion that I could be reasoned with, that the roles we had all played for years, me as the dependable one, them as the needy but lovable unit, would reassert themselves and make all this a temporary blip. A misunderstanding. He left a voicemail. I didn't listen. Then Mom called. Then texted. Then emailed. And that somehow hit me harder than I expected. There's a particular ache that only a mother's guilt can stir up, especially when that guilt is delivered not with fury, but with sadness. That deep, slow breathing kind of sorrow that seeps through a phone screen and grabs you by the rib cage. "Lisa, honey, I know things are hard, but please don't punish the girls," she wrote, as if the girls were hostages in some emotional standoff, as if I had weaponized their futures rather than simply retrieved my own boundaries from the landfill where I had left them years ago. She added, "Karen's very upset," and I couldn't help but laugh. An ugly, bitter little sound that cracked in my throat. Because what else was new? Karen's always upset, as long as something isn't orbiting her perfectly curated comfort zone. But Mom's next line is the one that stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. "I know you've been generous, but sometimes love means letting things go." Letting things go, the irony burned. Because what exactly had Karen ever let go for me? What had she ever held, ever absorbed, ever sacrificed so I could breathe a little easier, cry a little softer, sleep a little deeper? The math didn't add up. It never had. And I was done playing the part of the burden giver while everyone else reaped the comfort of my silence. Love doesn't mean erasing yourself to fit into someone else's frame. It doesn't mean standing outside in the cold while everyone inside raises a glass and says grace without you. Still, I could feel the old wiring firing off in my brain. Decades of conditioning telling me to call, to explain, to smooth it over with a compromise that would leave me hollow but them whole. And that's when I did the hardest thing I've done in years. I picked up the phone, opened the contact list, and one by one, I blocked every number tied to that branch of the family tree. Karen, Tom, Mom, even the girls, though I paused the longest before hitting that last one. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I didn't know how to exist in their lives without continuing to be the version of myself that bled out slowly for their comfort. People talk about boundaries like they're fences, like they're things you put up to keep the bad out and the good in. But for me, boundaries were more like severing ropes on a dock. After years of being tied to a boat that never once asked where I wanted to sail, I had been drifting in their direction for so long, I forgot I had a rudder of my own. And cutting those ties wasn't just an act of defiance. It was an act of survival. What nobody tells you about revenge, when it comes wrapped in silence instead of fury, is that it tastes less like victory and more like freedom. There were no fireworks, no applause, just the sudden disorienting space where noise used to be. And in that space, I started hearing myself again. Not the echo of who they wanted me to be, but the raw, unfiltered voice I hadn't listened to in years. The one that whispered, "You were never too much. They were just never enough." Later that day, I walked to the mailbox, something I hadn't done in a while, because I usually dreaded the bills and flyers and donation requests that all reminded me of how intertwined our lives used to be. But in the pile of paper, I found something unexpected. A handwritten letter. The return address was Mom's. She must have dropped it in the mail before she realized I wasn't answering anything digital. It was written in blue ink, her familiar looping cursive that used to sign my permission slips and birthday cards. The letter was short. It said, "I don't know what happened, but I know you're hurting. Please don't disappear. We can fix this." And for the briefest second, I almost cried. Not because I believed we could fix anything, but because it was the first time she'd acknowledged my pain, without turning it into a moral lesson or a spiritual test. But then I folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the counter like a museum artifact, something to be observed, not acted upon. I wasn't disappearing. I was reappearing, just not in the roles they had written for me. And if they couldn't recognize the version of me that no longer bowed, apologized, or paid, then maybe they never really saw me to begin with. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full of every sentence I never got to finish, every boundary I never dared to draw, every piece of myself I had given away thinking it would buy me a place at their table. And now, finally, I was sitting at my own. Grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up in the form of silence so thick it presses against your chest like wet wool, soaking everything and offering no comfort. And for me, that silence began exactly 3 years ago, on a gray, windless Tuesday, when I sat in a parking lot outside a pharmacy, unable to move, unable to think of a single reason to go inside and pick up the prescription that was supposed to make life bearable again. I remember the dashboard clock blinking steadily, as if mocking my paralysis, and I remember holding my phone in my lap like a lifeline I was too afraid to use, scrolling mindlessly through my contacts, hovering over Karen's name, not because I thought she would say the right thing, but because I just wanted someone to answer the phone and remind me that I mattered to someone, anyone, in that moment where everything felt like it was slipping through my fingers. That was the year everything started falling apart in quiet increments, like pieces of drywall flaking from a ceiling no one bothered to repair. My job had become unbearable under a new manager who clearly saw me as disposable. My closest friend had moved across the country without warning, and a relationship I had poured 5 years into ended in the most cowardly way imaginable. A sticky note on the fridge, and a bank account wiped clean of his half. And while none of those things killed me, they scraped away the last bit of energy I had left to pretend that I was okay. I wasn't okay. I was unraveling slowly, and when I finally told Karen, finally reached out not as the helper or the provider, but as someone who desperately needed to be held, even just metaphorically, she blinked twice, patted my hand across the table and said, "Lisa, maybe you need to talk to someone, a therapist or church, something outside all this." She gestured vaguely at me, as though my pain was a mess I had left on her carpet, and for the first time in our adult lives, I realized she wasn't uncomfortable because I was breaking. She was uncomfortable because I expected her to witness it. Karen, for all her mothering and hostessing and PTA chairing, never actually learned how to hold space for discomfort unless it fit neatly inside a casserole dish or a prayer circle. Real sadness, the ugly, unfiltered kind that doesn't come with a silver lining or a plan, was offensive to her sensibilities. It threatened the carefully curated illusion of control. She wrapped herself in, like a decorative shawl from one of her overpriced boutiques. So I took her advice. I talked to someone. And that someone, unlike my sister, didn't flinch when I said I sometimes fantasized about disappearing, didn't respond to tears with judgment or to exhaustion with solutions. I spent nearly a year rebuilding my internal structure, slowly and quietly, like someone piecing together a house after a hurricane, one brick at a time, until the rooms felt inhabitable again. And I never told Karen how deep the hole really was, how long I'd lived in that pit pretending I could climb out with grit alone, because deep down, I knew she wasn't interested in the parts of me that didn't serve her story of who I was supposed to be. She liked me stable, generous, mildly self-deprecating, and endlessly available. The moment I stopped performing that version, I became a liability. So when she wrote that I was too emotionally draining to include in Christmas, when she dared to frame my existence as an inconvenience after all the years I'd shown up when she needed a sitter or a donor or a sister who wouldn't ask for anything in return, I didn't see it as a rejection. I saw it as a confirmation. I saw the truth. I'd been dancing around for decades, finally spelled out in plain language. Lisa is only valuable when she is useful. The moment she becomes human, she's a burden. And what stung most wasn't the cruelty, but the casualness of it. The way she flicked me away like lint from her sweater, without even the courtesy of a phone call. Because that's what we were to her. Me, the girls, even Tom to some extent. We were all just accessories to her perfect little narrative. And the moment one of those pieces no longer fit, she quietly set it aside, without drama, without thanks, without remorse. That's not strength. That's convenience masquerading as boundaries. You see, people love to throw around the word boundaries these days, like it's some holy grail of self-care. But they forget that boundaries go both ways. You don't get to draw a line and then act shocked when the person on the other side starts building a life without you. You don't get to cut someone out and still expect the perks of their presence. That's not a boundary. That's exploitation with a prettier name. So when I canceled the accounts, when I blocked their numbers, when I said no without a footnote or an apology, I wasn't being spiteful. I was responding in kind. I was honoring their decision. They decided I didn't belong. I simply agreed and adjusted accordingly. And yet, here's the kicker. When Mom reached out, voice cracking on a voicemail she left at 2 a.m. saying, "I just don't understand how things got this bad," I realized the one person I hadn't protected myself from was her. Because Mom, for all her emotional manipulation and guilt trips, genuinely doesn't see the cracks she's stood on all these years. She thinks families hold because they should, not because they're nurtured. She believes in obligation over honesty, tradition over truth. And she didn't understand that by ignoring all the signs, by brushing off every time I tried to explain how tired I was, how used I felt. She had quietly picked a side. And it wasn't mine. Now, as I sit at my kitchen counter surrounded by an unfamiliar quiet that no longer feels like punishment but peace, I finally understand that loneliness isn't always about being alone. Sometimes it's about being surrounded by people who refuse to see you. And the second you stop begging to be seen, you become powerful, not loud, not cruel, just unshakably, silently free. There comes a moment, after all the chaos has passed, and the dust begins to settle on the wreckage you've willingly left behind, when you're no longer driven by adrenaline or vengeance, or even grief, but by an eerie kind of calm, an unsettling tranquility that follows the execution of a long overdue reckoning. And it doesn't announce itself with fanfare or triumph, but rather with a strange stillness in your chest, the kind that tells you something irreversible has happened, and whether or not it was right is no longer the point. That's exactly where I found myself in the days that followed my final act of withdrawal. Not in agony or celebration, but in a new kind of quiet, the kind where nothing tugs at your heart because, for the first time in years, no one is pulling. I had scheduled an appointment with my lawyer. Not because I needed to protect myself from any threats. There hadn't been any, just confusion, indignation, the kind of moral outrage that only people with selective memories and a sense of entitlement can muster. But because I wanted to ensure that, moving forward, everything that belonged to me would stay with me. The tuition accounts were closed, the health insurance family add-ons gone, but I wanted to go further. I wanted to revise my will, designate power of attorney, reallocate every single contingency I had built for the people who had now made it explicitly clear they didn't see me as anything other than a resource, a kind, self-funding, emotionally tolerable ghost who was expected to hover around the edges of their lives until she died quietly, preferably without asking too many questions. I walked into the law office without the nerves or uncertainty I might have expected. Instead, I felt a strange strength in my spine. A sense that I was no longer trying to make anyone proud, or feel indebted or even grateful. I was simply taking ownership of the years I had given away. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Cheryl, who had probably seen far more brutal family implosions than mine, raised an eyebrow when I outlined my requests. No more family beneficiaries, no more joint accounts, no fallback plans for nieces who were never allowed to see me bleed, but enjoyed the fruits of my labor nonetheless. "Do you want to leave a message behind for them?" Cheryl asked. And for a second I almost said yes. Not out of bitterness, but out of habit. That old compulsion to explain myself, to soften the blow, to take care of the very people who would never do the same for me. But I shook my head. "No," I said. "They've already heard enough of me. This time, they can sit with the silence." And that's exactly what I left behind. Not anger, not hate, just absence. The kind that lingers. The kind that makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to reckon with what they didn't say, didn't do, didn't notice until it was too late. I knew that Karen would frame this as cruelty, that she'd tell anyone who would listen that I had turned my back on the family, that I had weaponized money and emotions and played the victim like it was a game. But what she'd never say, not even to herself, is that she had spent years draining me dry, then turned around and blamed me for being empty. She would never admit that my silence was a mirror she didn't want to look into, because it showed her not a vindictive sister, but a woman who finally realized that love without reciprocity is just servitude with better piqûre. By the time Christmas rolled around, I had turned off every notification, canceled every subscription to the noise of their lives. The phone didn't ring anymore. My inbox was still, save for one message that stood out not because of who sent it, but because of how uncharacteristically raw it was. It was from Mom. The subject line was blank. The body just said, "I can't sleep. I keep thinking about how we got here. Please call. I'm crying as I write this." I read it once, then again, waiting to feel something, guilt, sadness, maybe even relief. But all I felt was an overwhelming awareness that I had reached the edge of something vast and unmapped, and instead of turning back, I was choosing to keep walking. Because the truth is, sometimes the only way to stop hurting is to stop pretending that the people who hurt you didn't mean to. Sometimes they meant to. Sometimes they didn't care. And sometimes the road to healing is paved not with forgiveness, but with distance so permanent it becomes indistinguishable from peace. I didn't call her, I didn't write back. Not because I didn't love her, but because I finally loved myself more than the version of me they were comfortable with. The one who stayed quiet, the one who paid, the one who made sure no one ever felt the weight of her own needs. That version was gone. And in her place was someone who had learned the hardest, most freeing lesson of all. You don't owe anyone access to you simply because you share blood. So if you ask me now whether I regret it, whether I regret the silence, the deletion, the boundaries drawn in permanent ink, I won't hesitate. No, I don't regret it. Because for the first time in my life, I am no longer a supporting character in someone else's story. I am not the fallback, the safety net, the reliable one who never asks for too much. I am the author, and the page is finally blank. You might hear this and think I went too far, that I let pain turn into cruelty, that I punished children for their mother's flaws, that I should have turned the other cheek like we were taught, like our mothers and their mothers were taught. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe we were all raised to believe that endurance was the same thing as love, that silence was noble, that martyrdom was the highest form of devotion. Maybe the most radical thing I ever did wasn't walking away, but refusing to stay just because it made everyone else more comfortable. And if you're still wondering whether they ever reached out again, if the girls ever tried to find me, if Karen ever apologized, I'll tell you this, it doesn't matter. Because the story isn't about them anymore. It's about me finally choosing myself. And that to me is the most unforgivable kind of freedom, the kind that doesn't ask for permission.